The town of Hollowbrook had always been quiet, peaceful even. But there was one thing that had always disturbed the locals: the Hollow Hill. Nestled at the edge of town, it stood tall, like a quiet sentinel over the sleepy village. But there was something different about it. No one quite knew why, but every time you walked near it, you felt a strange unease, a pull of something off. It was said that the hill was hollow. Generations had passed, and the rumor persisted. The hill was a mystery, and not many dared to explore it. Yet the story intrigued people. There had been whispers of strange sounds coming from within it, of eerie lights glowing at night, and of figures moving behind the trees at the top. But no one had ever ventured close enough to discover what was really going on. Until now. One chilly autumn evening, a group of curious young adults decided it was time to investigate. They had grown tired of the tales and legends that had been passed down for generations. Armed with nothing more than flashlights and the audacity of youth, they set out to uncover the truth. Emma, the fearless leader of the group, had heard about the Hollow Hill since childhood. She had spent years imagining what could be hidden beneath its surface, but never dared to investigate until now. Her friends, Ben, Lucy, and Alex, were with her, each sharing a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Ben said, his voice a mix of awe and apprehension. "It'll be fun," Emma replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Nothing to be scared of." Lucy, always the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, right. It's probably just some old mine or something. But I'm still curious about what the big deal is." As they approached the base of the hill, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves had all but ceased. It was as if nature itself had fallen still, waiting for something. Ben shone his flashlight around, casting long shadows across the trees. "What's that?" he asked suddenly, pointing at a faint silhouette near the hill's base. "I don't see anything," Lucy said, scanning the darkness. "I swear I saw something," Ben persisted, walking toward the hill's edge. The rest of the group followed cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The hill loomed before them, dark and imposing, its top shrouded in mist. At the bottom of the hill, an old wooden sign stood crookedly, its letters almost completely worn away. Only a few words could be made out: "Do not enter." The rest of the sign had been weathered by time and neglect. Alex, ever the brave one, let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that's ominous," he joked, but no one laughed. As they made their way up, the ground felt strangely soft beneath their feet, as if the earth itself were hollow. They climbed, each step heavier than the last, as if the hill didn't want them there. The trees around them seemed to close in, their branches twisting like fingers reaching toward the sky. "Okay, this is getting weird," Lucy whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I don't like the vibe up here." "Don't be such a scaredy cat," Ben teased. "We're just going to see what's on top. I bet it's just some old, abandoned structure or something." But when they reached the top, they found no abandoned structure. Instead, there was a strange, perfectly circular depression in the ground. It was as if the hill had caved in, but there was no sign of a cave opening or any visible hole. "This is it?" Alex asked, stepping into the circle. "This is what everyone's been so afraid of?" Before anyone could answer, a deep rumble echoed beneath their feet. The ground seemed to tremble, and then the air grew thick, as if something massive were shifting deep beneath them. "What the hell was that?" Ben exclaimed, his eyes wide with fear. The rumbling grew louder, and suddenly, the ground in the center of the depression began to crack. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the air, sending a shiver down their spines. "Run!" Emma shouted, but before they could move, the earth beneath them cracked open, and a deep, hollow sound rang out from below. From the center of the hill, a dark, shadowy figure began to rise. Its shape was indistinct at first, just a swirling mass of darkness. But slowly, it began to take form. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and as it emerged from the ground, the wind howled louder, as though warning them to flee. The air was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though every ounce of energy in the universe had turned against them. Emma felt her heart race in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure loomed above them, its eyes glowing a deep, haunting red. What is that?" Lucy stammered, her voice barely audible. I don't know," Emma replied, unable to take her eyes off the creature. The figure's form continued to shift, as if it were made of the very darkness itself. Then, in a voice that sent chills through their bones, the figure spoke. "You should not have come." The wind howled through the trees as Emma's heart raced in her chest. The dark figure before them seemed to grow larger, its eyes burning bright red, like two fiery coals in the midst of a storm. The air felt thick and heavy, and every breath she took seemed harder than the last. "You should not have come," the figure repeated, its voice like 1,000 whispers all speaking at once. It wasn't just words. It felt like the ground beneath them was saying it, like the whole hill was alive. Ben stepped back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The others were just as frozen in terror, their wide eyes locked on the figure as it loomed before them. The creature didn't move, but the air around it seemed to pulsate with energy. It was as if it was waiting for them to do something, anything to react. But Emma couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the ground, her body paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted again, and the air turned icy. A low rumble vibrated through the earth, and the trees around them groaned, their branches creaking like the bones of a giant. "What's happening?" Lucy whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Emma could hardly answer. Her throat felt dry, and the fear in her chest was growing, spreading like a wildfire. She wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but something deep within her told her that it was too late. They were already part of whatever had been unleashed. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, casting an eerie red light over everything. It seemed to be drawing energy from the hill itself, feeding on it, growing stronger with each passing second. The shadows around them deepened, and the wind picked up again, swirling around their bodies, tugging at their clothes. "Do you hear that?" Alex's voice cut through the noise, but it wasn't what Emma expected. His tone was more curious than fearful. Emma strained her ears, trying to hear over the deafening wind and the strange, unnatural hum that seemed to be coming from deep within the hill. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her, but then she heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like a voice calling from beneath the earth. It was faint but clear. "Help me." The voice was desperate, filled with pain and fear, but it wasn't just one voice. It was many. It sounded like dozens of people, all calling out in unison, trapped in the darkness beneath the hill. Emma's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced at her friends. They looked just as terrified as she felt. "Who's down there?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. She didn't know why she spoke, but the words just escaped her. She had to know, had to understand what was happening. The figure in front of them let out a low growl, a sound so deep it rattled her bones. "You should never have come," it repeated, this time with more anger, as if the hill itself was warning them. Without thinking, Emma stepped forward, drawn by the sound of those desperate whispers. She had to know. She had to understand why this place felt so wrong. Her hand reached out, almost against her will, and she touched the edge of the circular depression in the ground. Instantly, the earth seemed to tremble again, but this time it wasn't just the ground, it was the air. The atmosphere seemed to crackle with energy, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. "Emma, don't," Lucy cried out, but it was too late. The moment her hand made contact, the ground erupted with a deafening roar. The figure before them shrieked, the sound so loud it felt like it was ripping through her mind. A wave of pure darkness shot up from the center of the hill, engulfing everything in its path. Emma screamed, pulling her hand away, but the darkness was already closing in. It wasn't just shadows. It was alive, moving, swirling around her like tendrils, grasping at her, pulling her toward the center of the hill. She could feel its cold grip on her skin, its icy fingers reaching into her very soul. "Run!" she shouted, but the words were lost in the chaos. Her friends were already moving, stumbling back, but the darkness was faster. It spread like a flood, pouring out from the hill and engulfing them all. Ben's scream echoed through the night as the darkness pulled him under, his body disappearing into the void. Emma reached out, but there was nothing she could do. She could hear him, faintly, his voice muffled by the suffocating blackness. "Ben!" she cried, but there was no answer. Her heart pounded as she turned to Lucy and Alex. They were both in the same state, frozen, horrified, unable to move. The shadows were closing in on them too, and Emma knew they had to get out. She grabbed Alex's arm, yanking him toward her. "Come on," she shouted, but even as they turned to flee, the darkness seemed to follow them. The ground shook violently, sending them tumbling to the ground. They scrambled to their feet, their breath coming in ragged gasps, but the darkness was relentless. It was everywhere, surrounding them, cutting off their escape. They were trapped, caught in the middle of the hill's nightmare. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the figure spoke again, its voice low and ominous. "You've awakened it," it said. "Now you'll never leave." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. She felt the weight of them, like a curse being placed upon them. They had awakened something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the hill for centuries, and now it was free. Suddenly, the darkness receded, pulling back into the ground as quickly as it had appeared. The hill was still, the wind had stopped, and the air felt heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Emma's heart was still pounding in her chest as she turned to Lucy and Alex. They were all panting, shaking from fear. "What the hell was that?" Lucy gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice shaking, "but we have to get out of here. Now." But as they began to turn toward the edge of the hill, they heard something, a soft whisper on the wind. "Help me!" The voices from below had not stopped. The wind was still, but it felt wrong. The air around them was heavy, as if it was waiting for something to happen. Emma looked around, her heart still racing, but the hill seemed peaceful, almost calm. Too calm. "I don't like this," Alex muttered, his voice shaking as he glanced nervously at the ground. "We need to get out of here. Right now." Emma nodded in agreement, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The whispers from the hill still echoed in her mind. "Help me." Ben was gone. Emma hadn't seen him since the darkness had swallowed him up. Was he still alive? Was he trapped somewhere calling for help? The thought made her stomach twist in knots. "We have to find Ben," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt impossible, like searching for something that might never be found. But she couldn't leave him behind. She couldn't let whatever was buried beneath the hill take him. "Emma," Lucy said, her voice barely audible, "we can't. It's too dangerous. Look what happened to Ben." She paused, her eyes full of fear. I saw him, Emma. He vanished. Just like that. Emma knew Lucy was right. But Ben was their friend, and the feeling of his absence weighed heavily on her. The whispers, they were still calling. She could feel them in her bones. Alex, still looking around nervously, stepped forward. We're not leaving until we know what's really going on here. We need answers. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she wanted to find those answers. Whatever was down there was ancient, something old and powerful that didn't want to be disturbed. But Alex was right. They couldn't just walk away. Not now. We have to find out what this place is, she said. Her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. We need to know what we're dealing with. The three of them stood there, staring at the hollow hill. It looked so normal, so quiet. But they knew now that it was anything but ordinary. Let's go back to town and get some supplies, Lucy suggested, her voice hesitant. We can figure this out tomorrow. It's too dark to... No, Emma interrupted. We can't leave tonight. I have a feeling something will happen if we do. The group fell silent, unsure what to do next. They couldn't stay forever, but they couldn't leave either. The hill seemed to pulse with energy, its secrets begging to be uncovered. But was it too dangerous to find the truth? They decided to go back to the spot where they had first felt the pull of the darkness, the center of the hill. As they walked, Emma felt a chill on the back of her neck, like someone was watching them. Every step seemed heavier than the last. Suddenly, they heard it again, the whisper. "Help me." It was louder now, closer, more desperate. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she froze in place, listening. "There's someone down there," Alex said, his voice trembling. "We need to find out who it is," Emma replied, taking a step forward. She didn't know why, but she felt like the answers were waiting beneath the hill, hidden in the dark. The hill seemed to shift, the ground beneath them shifting with it. The wind started again, but it was colder now, like it had been waiting for them to come back. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Emma stepped closer to the edge of the hill, trying to peer into the darkness. It was too deep to see anything. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. "Do you think it's Ben?" Lucy asked, her voice shaking. "Maybe he's down there, still trapped." Emma didn't answer. She didn't want to believe it, but the thought of Ben being down there, lost in the darkness, terrified her more than anything. The whispers were growing louder now, overlapping each other. A chorus of voices crying out for help. They were trapped, just like the others, in whatever nightmare lay beneath the hill. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Emma felt a surge of fear, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know what was happening. "Let's go down," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "No!" Alex shouted, grabbing her arm. "We can't. It's too dangerous." But Emma had already turned, stepping closer to the hole in the ground. Her breath quickened as the whispers became clearer. It was like the voices were reaching out to her, calling her, begging her to come closer. "Emma, don't," Lucy cried, but it was too late. Emma felt the ground give way beneath her feet, and before she could react, she was falling. She let out a scream, but it was swallowed by the darkness around her. The cold air rushed past her, and her heart slammed in her chest. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but it was like falling into an endless void. The fall seemed to go on forever, but then, with a sickening thud, Emma landed hard on the ground. Pain shot through her body, but it wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the feeling that something was watching her. Her flashlight flickered to life as she slowly got up, her limbs stiff with cold. She looked around, but there was nothing but darkness. No trees, no wind, no sky, just the endless blackness of whatever lay beneath the hill. She was alone. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deep, low hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. It was coming from somewhere deep below her. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and she knew, deep down, that she wasn't alone. But then, she heard something. A movement in the dark, a rustle, followed by a faint scratching sound. Something was crawling toward her. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Lucy." There was no answer, only the scratching sound, getting louder and louder. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could feel it. It was large, its shadow stretching across the ground. It was moving toward her, slow and deliberate. Emma took a step back, her heart racing. "Who's there?" she called out, but her voice was lost in the void. The figure didn't respond. It just kept coming closer. Her flashlight flickered again, casting a brief glimpse of its face, and Emma gasped. It wasn't human. The creature was getting closer. Emma could hear the slow scrape of its claws against the ground, each movement sending a chill down her spine. Her flashlight flickered in her trembling hands, casting weak light over the dark, endless space. She took another step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was still moving toward her, its shape growing clearer in the dim light. It wasn't human. No, it was something worse, something ancient. Emma's breath quickened. She felt like she couldn't breathe, like the air itself was thickening around her, pressing against her chest. She stumbled back, her foot hitting something hard. She turned quickly, her pulse racing, but it was just a stone. There was nowhere to run. The creature was almost upon her now. She could make out its features in the weak light. It had long, gnarled fingers, each tipped with sharp claws that scraped across the ground. Its face was a grotesque mask, pale and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into her very soul. Emma tried to scream, but the sound was lost in her throat. Her voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness surrounding her. "Who? What are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. The creature didn't answer. It simply stood there, watching her with its empty eyes. A cold, unsettling silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of its breathing, slow, deep, almost rhythmic. Then, without warning, it moved again, lurching forward in a sudden burst of speed. Emma barely had time to react as it lunged at her, its claws reaching out. She screamed and ducked, rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding its grasp. She scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking with fear. "What is this?" she thought, panic flooding her mind. "What is this thing?" Her flashlight fell to the ground, the light going out with a small flicker. Darkness closed in around her again, but she could still hear the creature moving, its footsteps now echoing in the silence. She couldn't see it, but she could feel its presence, closing in on her. She reached out blindly, searching for something, anything that could help her. Her hand brushed against something cold and smooth. It was a wall, a smooth stone wall, cold to the touch. A sudden thought crossed her mind. Am I inside something? The idea sent a jolt of fear through her. The creature had led her into a trap, a place where there was no way out. She ran her hands along the wall, feeling for any sign of a door or an exit. But there was nothing, just smooth stone, as if the hill itself had swallowed her whole. Her breath was coming in quick, shallow gasps now. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. She turned and ran, even though she had no idea where she was going. The creature was still behind her. She could hear its heavy breathing, growing louder with every step. She dared not look back. She could feel its eyes on her, even if she couldn't see it. Then, Just as quickly as it had started, the sound of its footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Emma slowed, her heart still racing. She wasn't sure what to do. Should she keep running? Should she hide? What if it was just waiting for her to make a mistake? She stopped, her back pressed against the stone wall. She tried to steady her breathing, listening for any sign of movement. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. It sounded like a voice calling her name. Emma! She froze. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a chill through her. It sounded familiar, almost comforting. But no, it was a trick. She knew it. The creature, whatever it was trying to lure her out. Emma! The voice called again, closer this time. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. She wouldn't fall for it. Not this time. Who's there? She demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. There was a long pause. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. And then the voice answered. It wasn't the creature. It wasn't anything unnatural. It was Ben. Emma, I'm down here. Her heart skipped a beat. Ben? She turned toward the sound of his voice, hoping, praying that it was really him. But as she took a step forward, she stopped herself. What if it wasn't him? What if the creature had taken his voice, using it to trap her? What if it was still out there, waiting for her to let her guard down? But the voice sounded like Ben. She couldn't ignore it. Ben! She called out, her voice louder now. Where are you? The voice answered again, this time more urgently. Emma, please hurry. Without thinking, Emma ran toward the sound of his voice, her feet carrying her faster than she had ever run before. She didn't know if it was really Ben or if she was walking right into the creature's trap, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she felt that familiar pull, that desperate need to find him. Her feet hit the ground with a thud as she sprinted forward, the sound of her heartbeat deafening in her ears. The walls around her were closing in, the air growing colder with each step. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A faint light. It was small at first, barely visible through the darkness. But it grew stronger, brighter. It was coming from ahead of her. Ben? She called again, but this time, her voice was hoarse. She was so close now. She could almost reach it. The light grew larger until it illuminated the area around her. Emma's heart leapt in her chest. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished. A sharp pain shot through her chest. She staggered back, her hands gripping her head as if trying to hold onto her sanity. The darkness closed in once more, and the whispers returned, louder this time, screeching, crying, pleading. Emma, the voice echoed, and this time it wasn't Ben. It was something else, something older, something more terrible. She couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around her, the whispers turning into screams. The ground beneath her feet began to shake, as if the hill itself was alive with something ancient, something evil. And then the earth split. The ground trembled beneath Emma's feet as the earth split open with a loud, bone-shaking crack. She fell to her knees, her hands reaching out for anything to hold onto. The darkness around her seemed to pull her in, swallowing her whole. Her heart raced in her chest, and she gasped for air, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts racing. What was happening? The ground beneath her continued to shake. The walls of the hill felt like they were closing in on her, pressing down from all sides. Emma felt small, insignificant, lost in the vast emptiness of it all. Ben, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if it was really him she was searching for anymore. The whispering voices that had called her name felt far away now. But she couldn't stop. She had to find him. She had to find a way out. But the ground kept shaking. The walls kept closing in. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. It wasn't just the hill anymore. It was the thing beneath it. The creature. The one that had been hunting her. She could feel its presence now. Close, right behind her, breathing down her neck. She couldn't see it, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her every move. The sound of its claws scraping the stone echoed in the dark, sending a shiver down her spine. A faint sound reached her ears, something like a distant whisper, followed by a low growl. She turned quickly, her eyes wide in fear, but there was nothing there, just shadows, just the endless, suffocating darkness. The whisper grew louder. "Emma!" She spun around, her breath quickening. The voice was still distant, but it was close enough now that she could almost make out the words. "Emma, help me." It was Ben. She knew it was him, but how could it be? How could his voice reach her from so far away? Her mind raced with confusion, but something inside her told her to follow the voice. She had no choice. She had to find him. She had to help him. With trembling hands, Emma pushed herself to her feet, her knees wobbling beneath her. She stumbled forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides, but she couldn't stop now. She had to move. "Ben!" she shouted, her voice breaking through the silence. "Where are you?" Her voice echoed, bouncing off the walls of the hill. The sound seemed to reverberate in the dark, as if the hill itself was alive, listening to her every word. Then, from somewhere in the distance, she heard it. A low, echoing laugh. Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't Ben. It was something else. Something that wasn't human. The laugh grew louder, more twisted, and then silence. Emma froze, her blood running cold. She couldn't breathe. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she stood there, straining her ears for any sound. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening. For a moment, she considered turning back, running from the hill and everything inside it. But she couldn't. Not without knowing the truth. Not without finding out what was happening. What was so wrong with this place? She pressed forward, her footsteps echoing in the darkness. Her mind raced, the fear still clenching at her chest. But there was something else now. Something darker. Something that pulled her deeper into the heart of the hill. She didn't know how much time had passed. The darkness made it hard to tell. But the further she went, the heavier the air became, until it felt like she was wading through thick, wet fog. And then, out of nowhere, she saw it. A faint light. It was small, barely visible in the distance, but it was there. A soft glow, just enough to give her hope. She stumbled toward it, her legs aching, but the light seemed to get further away with every step. "Ben!" she called again, her voice hoarse from the effort. The light flickered, then vanished. "No!" Emma gasped, her heart sinking into her stomach. "No, no, no!" She had to reach it. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let it disappear. The light was the only thing that could lead her out of here. It was the only thing that could save her. She ran, her breath coming in sharp gasps, the darkness swirling around her like a living thing. The light flickered again, brighter this time, and she felt a strange surge of hope rush through her. She was close. She could feel it. And then, she heard something else. The creature. Its footsteps were heavy, deliberate, echoing through the darkness. She could feel its presence behind her, just out of sight. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see it. She didn't want to know how close it was. She ran faster, her mind focused only on the light ahead. But the creature was closing in, its footsteps growing louder, its growl more distinct. Emma's legs burned with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. And then, just as the creature's growl seemed to shake the very walls of the hill, Emma reached the light. She stumbled into it, her hands outstretched, desperate for any kind of safety. But what she found wasn't what she expected. It was a room, a small stone chamber, lit by flickering torches along the walls. The air was thick with dust and age, but what caught her attention the most was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was Ben, but not the Ben she knew. This Ben had hollow eyes, pale skin, and a twisted smile on his face. He was standing still as if waiting for her, his arms outstretched. Emma froze. Her heart stopped. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't you." Ben's twisted smile grew wider, and he stepped forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma," he said, his voice low and cold. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her body tense with fear. Ben's eyes, once full of warmth and life, were now empty, hollow, like the very hill she had been drawn into. His smile twisted in a way that made her blood run cold, and a feeling of dread washed over her. What happened to you?" she whispered, her voice shaky, barely above a breath. Ben's lips curled, his smile widening. "You shouldn't have come, Emma. You shouldn't have followed me." The words hit her like a slap to the face. She wanted to turn around, run, and never look back, but her feet were glued to the floor, her heart racing. The light that had seemed like salvation now felt like a trap. I don't understand," Emma stammered, her mind spinning. "What are you?" The twisted version of Ben took a step closer, his slow, deliberate movements making the air feel heavier. He was no longer the man she had known, the person she loved. The thing in front of her was something darker, something wrong. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. "The hill, Emma," Ben said, his voice now sounding hollow, like it came from the depths of the earth. "It's alive, and so am I." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" Ben let out a low laugh, one that echoed in the small room. "It's too late for you to understand. You should have stayed away." But now, he paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Now you're a part of it." His words hit Emma like a punch to the stomach. She took a step back, her legs unsteady. "No, I won't be part of this. I won't." But as the words left her mouth, the room seemed to close in on her. The walls, once distant, now seemed to press in, shifting and moving, as though the very stones of the hill were alive. The flickering torches on the walls cast long shadows, distorting the space around her. Ben took another step forward, his hand reaching out toward her. "You can't escape, Emma. It has you now. It's inside you." She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen, trapped by an unseen force. The room felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the hill itself were holding her in place. "No!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But deep down, she knew it was. She could feel it. Feel the weight of the hill's presence pressing down on her, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Suddenly, Ben lunged forward, his outstretched hand grabbing her wrist with a strength that wasn't human. She gasped in shock, trying to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. "You're mine now, Emma," he whispered, his voice now low and twisted. "We all are." Emma struggled, panic rising within her. She could feel the coldness of his touch seeping into her skin, spreading like ice through her veins. The darkness around her seemed to grow, pulling her into its depths. "No," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I won't let you have me." But the moment she spoke, the room seemed to shift again. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her feet cracked, sending a shock of fear through her. She felt herself being pulled, not by Ben's hand, but by something deeper, something more powerful. Her mind raced. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let herself become another part of this twisted place. But as much as she fought, she felt herself slipping, the darkness swallowing her whole. Ben's grip tightened. You don't have a choice, Emma. The hill chooses who stays and who becomes part of it. The words echoed in her mind as she felt herself being dragged deeper into the hill's grip. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her vision blurred, and her body felt heavier with every passing second. The darkness consumed her. Emma awoke with a start, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her body was slick with sweat. She was no longer in the room with Ben. The darkness had lifted, and she found herself in a different place entirely. She sat up quickly, looking around. She was outside, standing at the base of the hill, looking up at the towering mound of earth. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the landscape. It seemed peaceful, almost serene, but there was a lingering feeling in the pit of her stomach, a feeling that something was terribly wrong. Had it all been a dream? Was it real? She couldn't be sure. The images of Ben, of the creature inside the hill, still haunted her thoughts. She could still feel the coldness of his touch, the weight of the hill pressing down on her. Emma, she froze. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Ben's voice. She turned around, her heart racing. But there was no one behind her. The hill loomed ominously in the distance, silent and still. Ben, she called out, her voice trembling. Where are you? No answer. But the air around her grew heavier, as though something unseen was watching her. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't over. The hill was still calling her, still pulling her in. The faint whispering started again, drifting on the wind. Come closer, Emma. Come back. Her stomach twisted with fear. She had to get away. She couldn't go back to that place, to that darkness. She couldn't let the hill take her again. But as she turned to run, something stopped her. A shadow moved on the hilltop, shifting against the fading light of the sunset. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, her feet frozen to the earth beneath her. The shadow on the hilltop shifted again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing there. A tall, dark shape against the setting sun. She wanted to run. Her mind screamed at her to get away, to leave the cursed hill behind. But her body wouldn't obey. It was as if the earth itself held her captive, its unseen grip tightening around her chest. A faint whisper brushed against her ear, so soft that it almost felt like the wind. But there was no wind. Come back, Emma. Is waiting for you. Her heart raced. She spun around, her eyes darting across the landscape. But there was no one there. Nothing but the quiet, empty hillside. The shadows stretched long across the ground, and the fading light of day seemed to make everything feel wrong. It's waiting. The voice came again, this time clearer, more urgent. It was Ben's voice, but it wasn't him. Not anymore. Emma felt a wave of nausea sweep over her. The hill wasn't just alive. It was calling to her, pulling her toward it. She tried to turn and run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in quicksand. Every step was harder than the last. The hill, it had already taken Ben. It was reaching for her now. She closed her eyes, trying to push the fear away, trying to think clearly. She had to escape. There had to be a way out. You can't run, Emma. The voice seemed to come from everywhere. She opened her eyes, looking wildly around. The landscape before her began to change. The ground under her feet shifted, like the earth was alive, breathing with an unsettling rhythm. The hill seemed to rise, growing taller, its peak becoming a dark silhouette against the dimming sky. Then she saw it, the figure from before standing at the top of the hill. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. But there was something horribly wrong with it. The figure was tall, too tall, and its limbs were twisted in unnatural ways. Its face was obscured in darkness, but Emma could feel its eyes on her, piercing through the distance. Then, she thought, a desperate whisper in her mind, but she knew it wasn't him. The person standing on the hill was something far worse. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. She gasped for breath, her chest tightening. "Help me." Her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the growing darkness that surrounded her. She looked toward the town, but it seemed so far away now. The hill had trapped her, and there was no escape. The figure began to move, descending slowly down the hill. Every step it took sent a chill down Emma's spine. It was coming closer. It was coming for her. She stumbled backward, her legs trembling. The terror in her chest spread like wildfire. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't deny, that whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it had her. The whispers were louder now, swirling in her ears, like voices rising from the depths of the earth. "Come closer, Emma. We've been waiting for you." Her heart pounded, and she forced her feet to move. She ran. No, she didn't run. She couldn't even tell if she was running anymore. Her body felt detached from her mind. It was as though the hill had taken control of her, dragging her toward it, pulling her closer and closer. The figure on the hill was almost at the bottom now, and Emma knew that time was running out. There was no way she could outrun it, no way she could fight it. She glanced behind her, just for a second, and that was all it took. She stumbled. Her foot caught on a root that she hadn't seen, and she fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through her knees, but she barely noticed. All she could focus on was the figure, getting closer, faster. It wasn't Ben. Couldn't be. But the twisted thing that had once been her friend, her love, was still there, hidden beneath the skin of whatever stood before her now. And it was calling her, beckoning her, dragging her closer to its dark embrace. She got to her feet again, but she didn't have much time. Her legs were weak, and her breath came in short gasps. The figure was almost upon her now, its long, unnatural limbs reaching for her. She could feel its cold presence before it even touched her. It was the hill itself, reaching out with its hunger. Please no. She didn't know if she was begging for her life or for the pain to end. But it didn't matter. The thing was upon her now. The moment it touched her, everything went dark. Emma woke with a start, gasping for air. Her chest was tight, and her throat felt raw as though she had been screaming. She sat up, disoriented, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The familiar feeling of the hill's cold grasp seemed to linger, but the landscape around her was different. The sky was light, and the air was warm, not heavy and suffocating. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the fog from her mind. What had just happened? Was it a dream? No, she could still feel the chill. She could still hear the whispers in the back of her mind, distant but insistent. Come back, Emma. It's not over. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and took a slow, cautious look around. She was on the outskirts of the town, standing near the edge of the hill. But this time, something was different. The hill seemed quieter, less menacing. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. She had to find Ben. She had to stop whatever it was that had taken him, that was now coming for her. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the trees as Emma stood at the base of the hill, trembling. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in the hollow silence around her. The wind had stopped, and the air felt still, as though the world was holding its breath. She had woken up only minutes ago, feeling like she had been ripped from a nightmare, but the echoes of the hill's call still haunted her. The shadows of the trees stretched long, casting dark figures across the ground. The hill loomed in front of her, as tall and ominous as ever. "It's not over," the voice whispered again, so faint she almost thought it was in her head. But she knew it wasn't. The hill was calling her, pulling her toward it. Whatever was hiding beneath the earth, whatever had taken Ben, was still there. But Emma couldn't give in. She had to stop it. She couldn't let it claim her too. Not after everything she had been through. Not after what had happened to Ben. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She could still remember his face, twisted, unrecognizable. The way he had looked at her in the end, as though something else was controlling him, something ancient and hungry. She took a deep breath, the air feeling colder than it had a moment ago. She had no plan, no idea what she was walking into, but she couldn't just stand there. She had to face whatever this was head on. She had to end it. Emma's feet moved of their own accord, her legs stiff as she made her way up the hill. With each step, the ground seemed to shift beneath her, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing in time with her footsteps. The air grew thick again, and the whispering voices grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer. Come back, Emma." The sky above her began to darken as she ascended, the sunlight fading into a muted gray. The trees around her swayed, though there was no wind. The ground was soft and treacherous, like the hill was fighting against her, urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. At the top of the hill, the wind picked up again, and Emma paused. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. There, at the peak, was the same dark figure she had seen earlier. It stood motionless, its silhouette barely visible against the dimming sky. Emma's chest tightened, and a wave of nausea rose within her. She could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see its face. The air around it was colder, sharper. Ben, she thought, but the word felt empty in her mind. The person standing before her wasn't him. Couldn't be. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice echoed in her mind, but it wasn't Ben's anymore. It was something else. Something that had been lying dormant beneath the hill for far too long. She could feel its hunger, its yearning to claim her, to pull her into the darkness that it had already claimed so many others. A low rumble reverberated through the earth beneath her feet. The ground trembled, and for a moment, Emma thought the hill might swallow her whole. She stepped back, her heart racing in her chest, and then she saw it. The ground cracked open in front of her, a deep, gaping wound in the earth. Something moved beneath it, something massive, shifting and writhing like it was coming to life. Emma stumbled backward, fear flooding through her veins. It was the hill itself. It was alive, and it was about to consume her, just like it had consumed everyone else. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she raced down the hill. The earth seemed to stretch and bend beneath her, trying to pull her back. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with the effort, but she didn't dare stop. She couldn't. The hill seemed endless, its descent stretching before her like a dark tunnel. The voices were growing louder, their whispers clawing at her mind. She could feel the coldness of the hill creeping up her spine, like fingers wrapping around her neck. And then she heard it, Ben's voice. His voice, but twisted, distorted, filled with pain. "Emma," she froze, unable to move, her heart sinking in her chest. His voice came from behind her, from the hill, reaching for her. She wanted to turn, to face him, but she knew better. She had seen what the hill had done to him. Whatever was left of him, it wasn't Ben anymore. She shook her head, her hands trembling at her sides. No, the whispering voices surged in volume, becoming a cacophony of screams, each one more desperate than the last. They clawed at her mind, drowning out all reason, all thought. The ground beneath her trembled again, and Emma stumbled, her legs giving way. But then, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this thing win. She wasn't going to let it claim her. She couldn't. With every ounce of strength she had left, she stood up and ran. She ran as fast as she could, her feet pounding against the earth. The voices were still there, clawing at her, but they were fading, losing their power over her. She pushed forward, refusing to give in to the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. And then she saw it, the town, the lights, the safety of the people. She didn't stop, not even when she felt the hill's presence trying to pull her back. She just kept running. She didn't stop until she was safely in her car, speeding away from the hill, from the voices, from the terror that had haunted her for so long. And when she finally looked back, all that was left was the hill, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened. But Emma knew better. The hill wasn't done. It was just waiting for the next person to stumble upon its dark secrets. And so, she drove on, her heart heavy with the knowledge that some things are never truly gone. Some things, like the hollow hill, will always be waiting for their next victim.